When I first met Alice in college, I thought I'd stumbled upon a kindred spirit, the kind of friend who feels more like family than just a buddy from class. We forged our bond during late-night study sessions, swapping secrets about our biggest fears and wildest dreams, always pushing each other to reach higher. Once upon a time, we were inseparable, the kind of friends who would be the first on each other's speed dial whenever anything exciting or disastrous happened. Through heartbreaks, job changes, and cross-country moves, we stuck together like glue. Then we both got married, and though life grew busier, we still carved out time to nurture our friendship. Ken entered the picture not long after Alice graduated and was figuring out her next career move. Alice had been through a harrowing relationship in the past, one so traumatic that I was relieved beyond words when Ken came along. He was dependable, quiet, but confident, and he seemed to take genuine pride in being a pillar of stability for Alice and her young daughter. My own husband quickly befriended him, and soon we were one of those two-couple friend groups, going on double dates and taking summer trips together. But life has a way of unraveling even the most stable bonds, and what we thought was a perfect balance between friendship, family, and career turned out to be a web of fragile ties just waiting to snap. But even in the most picturesque unions, cracks can form beneath the surface. No matter how solid things appear, a single decision or a single betrayal can send everything spiraling into the darkness. And in Alice's case, that darkness came faster and harder than anyone ever expected. It all began when Alice's career took off. She's always been driven, the sort of person who's constantly pushing herself to climb one rung higher on the corporate ladder. A few years back, she got a promotion that required extensive travel, 3 or 4 months away from home each year, and a workload that spilled into weekends. She thrived on that pace, lighting up whenever she talked about a new deal she'd closed or a conference she'd attended. Yet every time I asked if Ken was okay with all the traveling, she'd wave it off, saying he understood and supported her ambitions. I wanted to believe her. I really did. As Ken and Alice tried to manage her constant absences, the tension in their marriage began to show. Ken, who worked out of his metal shop on their property, felt like he was always playing second fiddle. From what Alice told me, he resented her job for dominating all her time, for overshadowing even their most basic family routines, like having dinner together or scheduling a summer vacation. Still, I couldn't imagine he'd ever leave. He'd stepped into a fatherly role for her daughter without flinching, and he loved that kid as if she were his own. When I visited, the house felt normal enough, maybe a bit quiet, but never hostile. Yet quiet tension can be more dangerous than open conflict. Outright fights can force issues to the surface, creating space for resolution. But silent resentment? That can fester until it explodes in a single devastating moment. The day Ken finally walked out, Alice was blindsided. He'd already rented an apartment, moved a chunk of his belongings to a storage unit, and even quietly shifted the more valuable tools from his workshop to a temporary location. Alice came home from one of her business trips to find a note on the counter, and Ken's side of the closet virtually empty. When she called me that night, her voice was trembling, cycling between heartbreak and rage. She kept asking how he could do this to her. Why now? Why so suddenly? But we both knew it wasn't sudden. It was the result of months, maybe years, of unresolved frustration. He had left because he felt neglected, she explained through sobs. He said the spark had fizzled, that her job had consumed her, leaving him and their daughter to feel like afterthoughts. I tried to comfort her, feeling torn because she was obviously hurting. Yet I also knew Ken wasn't making these accusations out of thin air. Was there a chance this could be saved if Alice chose a position with fewer travel demands? Or if Ken learned to accept that she would always be ambitious? These were open-ended questions, and I didn't have the answers. But I believed that, despite the turbulence, they would find a way back to each other. Never assume you've seen the worst of a storm until it has passed. I had no idea that the worst was yet to come, that the storms ahead would leave everyone gasping for air, especially Alice. 3 weeks after Ken moved out, things reached a boiling point. Alice, spiraling in her loneliness, began drinking more than usual. She insisted it was just her way of coping, but even I could tell she was trying to bury her disappointment in alcohol. One weekend, Ken was supposed to return their daughter on Sunday evening. Only, Alice had lost all track of days, consumed by her night of fun, with 2 younger men. The details of that evening came to me in bits and pieces, but each new revelation was more unsettling than the last. Empty bottles were all over the place, clothes scattered, and Alice was barely coherent when Ken showed up with their daughter in tow. Ken, stepping inside only to find a chaotic scene, quickly shielded their daughter's eyes and took her back to the truck. Alice, outraged and too drunk to comprehend reality, hurled slurred insults at him, acting as though he was in the wrong for coming by early. In fact, she was an entire day off, so far gone that she'd lost track of time. The younger men, both interns from her company, scrambled to gather their stuff and escape the meltdown. When I heard about it later, my heart broke, and a part of me felt like I was witnessing the downfall of someone I loved. This wasn't the Alice I recognized, but shocking as that hot tub incident was, it only served as a preview to an even more bewildering betrayal. Sometimes, when you think a person has already hit rock bottom, you discover there's a whole new set of lows beneath the surface. In the aftermath, Ken decided he was done trying to stay amicable. He wanted the house, full custody of their daughter, and enough child support to make Alice feel the sting of what she had done. My husband, who was close friends with Ken, sided with him. He called Alice irresponsible, even going so far as to say she was a bad mother and a self-centered opportunist. I understood his anger, but it also put me in an impossible position. Alice was my best friend, and while her actions were horrifying, I believed she needed help, not abandonment. Even so, I wasn't blind. I saw the destruction she was causing in real time. Over and over, I tried to remind my husband of all the times Alice had been there for us. She'd helped me through my own hard times, listened when we fought, and offered a shoulder to cry on. But he wouldn't let go of how Ken felt. He kept saying Ken confided in him, that Ken had told him everything about Alice's disrespect and how she had basically deserted them. He pointed out that if we stayed close to Alice, we'd be dragged into more drama. The words stung, but I couldn't deny there was a kernel of truth in them. Alice was on a wild spiral, and everyone around her risked getting burned. Sometimes, taking a step towards someone in pain can feel like stepping into quicksand. You want to help, but the more you struggle to pull them out, the deeper you both sink. And that was precisely where I found myself. Despite my husband's warnings, I agreed to meet Alice one Saturday morning. I planned to show up with coffee, maybe tidy up a bit around the house, and gently nudge her toward professional help. I wanted to believe that this was just a phase, that behind the drinking and anger was the friend I'd known for over a decade. Yet, from the moment she opened the door, her defensive posture told me this wouldn't be a calm conversation. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed, she greeted me with a brittle, "What do you want?" as if I were some nosy neighbor rather than her long-standing confidant. I tried to approach the topic of therapy, of seeking help for her drinking, of reevaluating her priorities before she lost custody of her daughter for good. She scoffed, stating she was only blowing off steam after working herself to the bone for years. To her, Ken was an ungrateful husband who reaped the benefits of her high-paying job yet complained every step of the way. She framed her meltdown as a byproduct of stress and heartbreak, not the harbinger of deeper emotional issues. No matter what angle I took, she wouldn't hear it. But that wasn't the worst revelation of the day. Something else was brewing behind Alice's cold demeanor, something that would shatter every illusion I had left about her ability to choose healthy relationships. A couple of our mutual friends had whispered rumors that Alice might have been unfaithful to Ken before he even left. I didn't want to believe them. But if you'd asked me 3 months prior whether Alice could drunkenly welcome 2 interns into her hot tub while her daughter was in the next room, I would have said that was impossible too. So, with a churning stomach, I asked her point blank if there was anyone else. She erupted at me, lashing out with accusations of betrayal. How dare I even ask her such a question after all our years of friendship? The conversation turned tense. She insisted she'd never cheated, that the hot tub fiasco was simply a stupid night that got out of hand. When I pressed about the 2 men, she said they were legal, in this smug, dismissive way that chilled me. It was as if she was disassociating from the consequences of her actions, even from her own moral code. That's when I realized how profoundly she had changed. This wasn't just a reaction to heartbreak. This was a deep personality shift, a person rewriting her entire identity to cope with disappointment. And just when I thought she couldn't surprise me any further, I noticed something so off, so peculiar, that I felt the first twinge of true alarm. You could say it was the final puzzle piece, but in reality, it opened a door to an even darker secret. She was packing for what she claimed was yet another business trip. Normally, she'd have a small rolling suitcase, stuffed with elegant blazers, pencil skirts, and maybe a few business casual outfits for dinners with clients. But on this day, I saw her folding up thick sweatshirts, heavy pants, a beanie, and hiking boots. The forecast here was still scorching, and the destination she claimed, Dallas, wouldn't require such cold weather gear. My eyebrows shot up, but I held my tongue. Maybe she was anticipating an overly air-conditioned hotel. Maybe she was planning a quick side trip. Still, it made no sense. Tucked into the bottom of her duffel bag was a Seattle Mariners jersey. Now, Alice doesn't watch baseball, never has. That piece alone made me suspect something was up. Why would she suddenly become a fan of a team that plays clear across the country from Dallas? The discrepancy gnawed at me, but her behavior was so prickly that day, I couldn't bring myself to confront her on it. Instead, I left her house with a heavy heart, certain that she was lying but not sure how to uncover the truth. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's right under your nose. What I found out next shook me to my core. Alice wasn't just lying about a trip. She was lying about the entire direction her life was taking. When I got home, I told my husband everything. The bizarre packing, the Mariners jersey, the weird tension. He nodded grimly, saying it sounded like she was up to no good. He spent a few hours online, doing a bit of amateur detective work, and discovered a social media profile for Alice's ex, the biological father of her daughter. The profile picture? Him at a Mariners game in Seattle. My heart pounded as the pieces slid into place. The jerseys, the cold weather gear for a city that was nowhere near as hot as Dallas, the secrecy. Alice was heading straight into the arms of the man who had once broken her beyond recognition. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number, my hands shaking. When she picked up, I forced my voice to stay steady and asked, "Are you really going to Dallas?" Her pause spoke volumes, before she finally answered yes, insisting she had work commitments. I pressed further, each word dripping with the betrayal I felt. "Are you sure you're not going to Seattle to see him?" Another long silence. I threatened to find out, to expose her if she lied. Eventually, she admitted the truth. She had reconnected with her ex, who claimed he had changed and wanted a second chance. Reckoning with the past can be liberating, but it can also be a cage that traps us with old mistakes. For Alice, it felt like she was about to chain herself to the very person who once wrecked her life, and I was powerless to stop her. I didn't mention her ex much before because, for years, he was just a painful chapter Alice wanted locked away forever. He had been physically aggressive, verbally vile, and so toxic that he rejected both Alice and their baby when she was pregnant. After everything he had done to her, I couldn't fathom why she would even take his calls, let alone lie to me about flying across the country to be with him. It was as though she had completely erased all those bruises, both emotional and physical, that he left behind. My anger rose, hot and fierce, as I begged her to remember the abuse, to recall the terror she felt when she had to flee that relationship. Alice's voice on the line was unnervingly casual. She insisted he had turned over a new leaf, found steady work, cut back on partying, and wanted to be part of his daughter's life now. She told me he was remorseful about his past, that he realized he'd made a grave mistake. My mind screamed that this was classic manipulative behavior, the abuser's cycle of contrition, drawing victims back in with the promise of change. But Alice would hear none of it. She said she was a big girl who could handle her own life, that I was overstepping by trying to hold her back from something that might make her happy. Sometimes, the most gut-wrenching realizations come from watching someone you love sprint toward the very disaster you once helped them escape. And at that moment, I wondered if I was witnessing a final betrayal, hers against herself. My heart pounded with memories of the day I first rescued her from that man. She had called me weeping, her face bruised and her spirit shattered. I flew to Seattle, scooped her and the baby up, and brought them back to my place. Those were dark days, with Alice trembling each time the phone rang, terrified her ex would track her down. Bit by bit, she healed, found a job, discovered her own strength, and built a stable life. Meeting Ken was like the universe gifting her a fresh start. He adored her child, provided stability, and loved Alice wholeheartedly. I often thought of how proud I was of her resilience. Now, that resilience felt lost, replaced by some reckless version of Alice who believed returning to an old flame would solve her heartbreak. Every time I thought about him meeting her daughter again, my stomach twisted. The idea of that man trying to play daddy after all these years, after the vile way he treated them, was sickening. But Alice had latched onto some fantasy, refusing to see the gaping pitfalls. Those illusions can be more dangerous than any lie, because when you're blinded by hope, you often ignore the warning signs blazing right in front of you. And Alice was speeding down a highway of red flags. Finally, in a burst of raw fury, I told her exactly how I felt. I reminded her of every bruise and every tear, of every humiliating name he'd called her, and every time he insisted he wanted nothing to do with his own child. I told her this was the worst choice she'd made, and that included the drunken fiasco that had nearly cost her custody. She tried to brush me off, claiming that I was overreacting, that she knew better now, and that people could change. I reminded her that Ken had been the one to step into a fatherly role. Ken had been the one to nurse her back to mental stability. Ken had been the one who never raised a hand or voice in anger. She didn't want to hear it. The conversation escalated. I shouted, calling her out for betraying not just me and Ken, but herself. My voice was so loud, my husband rushed into the room, eyes wide with concern. Alice said she was sorry for lying, but that she had to do what was best for her. She insisted she could handle it, that she'd keep her daughter safe, that she wasn't going to let history repeat itself. But how could she guarantee that? The man she was running back to had proven his capacity for harm. It didn't matter if years had passed. Some scars don't vanish. In that moment, I knew I had to make a choice. Stand by and watch her spiral into a life of heartbreak and potential abuse, or cut ties before her chaos consumed me as well. It was a harrowing ultimatum. Rage and heartbreak mingled in my chest as I told her not to contact me if she went through with the trip. I told her that lying to me, pushing everyone away, and jeopardizing her daughter's emotional well-being was something I could not stand by and condone. She fell silent, then quietly promised she'd call me when she landed in Seattle, hoping to calm my fears. But I'd had enough. The betrayal burned in my gut. I hung up, tears streaming down my face. I felt unmoored, uncertain if this was really the end of a friendship that had spanned more than a decade of joys and sorrows. My husband pulled me into a hug, murmuring that he was sorry. He'd long suspected that Alice was on a self-destructive path. He reminded me that sometimes we cannot save people who refuse to save themselves. That sometimes protecting our own sanity means knowing when to let go. Ken was already resolved to finalize the divorce. He wanted to fight tooth and nail for full custody. Given Alice's recent behavior and the risk of her dragging the child into a potentially harmful environment, I couldn't blame him. But it gutted me to see the once loving family we had known crumble to pieces. Endings can feel like bottomless pits, yet sometimes after the fall, you realize the pit had a floor all along, and hitting it can jolt you into a new understanding of what truly matters in life. Alice texted me the next morning, her words a fragile apology tinged with defiance. She wrote that she was going to Seattle, that she had made up her mind, and believed everyone deserved a second chance. She also told me she was a grown woman who didn't need supervision. I stared at the phone screen, feeling that same sense of dread creeping up my spine. I typed back, demanding she not bring her daughter near him, but I never pressed send. I erased the message, feeling it would fall on deaf ears. Instead, I blocked her number, my hands trembling with the weight of that final act. For a moment, it felt like the world slowed down, as if giving me a chance to process the reality that I was severing ties with my best friend. Memories flooded my mind. The day we met, the time we celebrated her acceptance into a prestigious internship, the moment she confided in me about her unplanned pregnancy, and how I stood by her through the heartbreak that followed. All of it seemed overshadowed by her recent decisions, by the meltdown that turned her life upside down and left everyone else in the wreckage. Yet, in our most vulnerable moments, we catch a glimpse of something deeper, a truth about loyalty, boundaries, and the cost of enabling someone's self-destruction. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Ken's reaction was predictably grim. When I told him that Alice had confirmed her trip to Seattle, he sighed and shook his head. He mentioned he'd already spoken with his lawyer about the custody battle. In his eyes, the evidence of her unstable behavior, especially if she was reconnecting with an abusive ex, would favor him in court. My heart hurt for him, for their daughter, but I couldn't muster any sympathy for Alice at that moment. She was making her bed, and as cruel as it sounded, she might have to lie in it alone. My own husband, though relieved I had finally broken things off with her, was no less somber. He knew I felt betrayed, that I believed in Alice's better nature for so long, that her sudden shift made me question everything. He tried to comfort me with gentle reminders that people can show a side of themselves we never knew existed, especially when cornered by life's disappointments. While I wanted to cling to the idea that she might turn things around, reality told me she'd have to want that change for herself. And right now, she was too lost in her own spiral to accept a lifeline. Where do you go when trust is shattered by someone you once called a sister? How do you move forward when the memories of what once was whisper constantly about what might have been? For days, I struggled to reconcile the heartbreak and anger inside me. I confided in a couple of friends who knew parts of the story, but I couldn't bring myself to share every humiliating detail. Some suggested it was time for me to prioritize my own mental well-being, to see a counselor if needed, because bearing the weight of Alice's choices was too heavy for one person. Others said she would come around eventually when she realized the gravity of her decisions. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew I had to accept that the friend I loved might be gone forever. I remembered how Alice used to talk about her daughter's future, wanting her to grow up feeling loved and supported. Now, the child seemed to be spending most of her time with Ken, even preferring to stay at his new place. The stability he offered was a stark contrast to Alice's chaotic partying and impulsive life choices. That heartbreak knowing a mother might lose her daughter's trust was almost too painful to contemplate. How would her daughter feel years down the road if she understood the depth of her mother's behavior? Pain can either break a person or push them to transform. At this crossroads, Alice could have chosen redemption. Instead, she seemed to embrace the very trap that once destroyed her, and I was left to watch from a distance. I found myself replaying the last real conversation Alice and I had before everything went off the rails. We were sitting at my kitchen table, sipping iced tea. She was gushing about her latest work project, a high-profile client who loved her ideas. The corners of her eyes crinkled with genuine enthusiasm, the same sparkle I'd seen all those years ago in the dorm room when we were daydreaming about our post-college futures. I held on to that memory like a precious artifact, a reminder of who she once was before ambition, resentment, and heartbreak twisted her life into knots. Yet I couldn't ignore the reality. That version of Alice seemed lost, replaced by someone who openly defied all the values she once cherished. She cared about success, but at the expense of her marriage. She cared about independence, but ironically chained herself to a new wave of reckless partying. She cared about protecting her daughter, yet risked exposing her to an abusive ex who had rejected them both. Every piece of logic pointed to the same conclusion: Alice was drowning in denial, and I couldn't dive in after her. Even the strongest swimmer can drown if they refuse to see the waves pulling them under. Sometimes, you have to save yourself, even if it means leaving someone else behind. Ken proceeded with the divorce, layering the case with documented evidence of Alice's irresponsible behavior. Screenshots of texts, witness accounts of her drunken outbursts, and even the hot tub incident came into play. Word spread among the social circle, and soon, people began sharing their own uneasy stories about Alice's late-night escapades and confrontations. As Ken gathered more and more information, it looked increasingly likely that a judge would side with him. The heartbreak in all of this was that it seemed so avoidable had Alice chosen to meet him halfway, or even sought professional help. My husband reminded me that I shouldn't blame myself, that nothing I did or didn't do could have prevented Alice's downfall. But guilt is a tricky thing. It seeps in, telling you that if you had only reached out sooner or said the right words at the right time, maybe it would have made a difference. Logically, I understood that Alice's decisions were her own. Emotionally, I was a wreck. Every memory felt tinged with regret. The birthday parties, the weekend trips, the nights we spent laughing until our stomachs ached. In the end, those memories now carried the bitter taste of lost innocence. Sometimes, our memories become the only proof that a person was once different, an echo of who they used to be. But echoes fade, and clinging to them can stall our own journey toward healing. When I heard rumors that Alice's ex wanted to meet their daughter, I felt a surge of panic. The man who once demanded Alice move out of his home when she was pregnant, who physically mistreated her, and who openly disavowed fatherhood, was now proclaiming himself reformed. The idea that her daughter might be lured into trusting him made my blood boil, yet my fury found no target. Alice didn't care about my warnings anymore, and Ken was legally powerless to stop her if she claimed it was just a visit. Only the court's final custody decision could protect that child full-time. In a fit of desperation, I tried calling Alice from a different number, not to berate her but to beg one last time for her to reconsider. She answered with guarded impatience, as though she expected me to harass her. When I started talking about how worried I was, about the risk she was taking, she cut me off and said that I had no business interfering in her personal life. She insisted she could handle her ex, that she'd moved on from her previous traumas. I hung up, tears burning my eyes, realizing the futility of it all. Regret without action turns into self-torture, but action without acceptance can be just as destructive. And in that moment, I learned that even love has its limits when it's met with denial. Days blurred into weeks. The once steady presence of Alice in my life shrank to the occasional mention in mutual friends' conversations. People asked me if I'd heard from her, and I had nothing to say. I'd blocked her, told her not to call, and she seemed to respect that boundary. A grim sense of finality weighed on me, as if I were mourning someone who was still alive but no longer present in my world. My husband and I tried to move forward, focusing on our own relationship and future plans, yet the ghost of Alice's friendship haunted me at odd hours. Ken kept us updated on the legal proceedings here and there, mostly through my husband. He filed for temporary full custody, citing potential emotional endangerment. At one point, he discovered that Alice had, in fact, brought their daughter to Seattle for a weekend to meet her biological father, without Ken's permission. The backlash was swift and merciless, with Ken's lawyer threatening emergency court action. I never got the full details of how that confrontation ended, but from the tone in Ken's messages, it was anything but amicable. And so the storm raged on. Sometimes, the closer you get to the eye of the storm, the eerier the calm seems, like a sinister pause before another wave of chaos hits. An acquaintance who still followed Alice on social media told me that Alice seemed happier than ever, posing in pictures with her ex and boasting about her big love or fresh start. I stared at the photos, noticing the forced smiles and the tension behind her eyes that only someone who truly knew her would recognize. Everyone else was congratulating her in the comments, praising the power of forgiveness. They had no idea what kind of man she was forgiving, or how dangerous it might be to place him in her daughter's life. The whole situation felt like a slow-motion car wreck, terrible to witness, impossible to stop. Late one night as I lay awake, I revisited my favorite memories of Alice, the day she gave birth, when I rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night to hold her hand, her wedding day to Ken, where she glowed with a happiness that seemed unbreakable. The time we went backpacking in Europe after college, giggling in cheap hostels over silly inside jokes. These weren't illusions. They were genuine glimpses of a woman who once valued love, respect, and friendship above all else. Now, I didn't know her anymore, and that realization opened a well of grief inside me. Yet sometimes, letting go is the bravest thing you can do. A sad acceptance can lead you toward clarity, even if it feels like you're giving up on someone you desperately want to save. My husband tried to comfort me by reminding me that people change, and sometimes not for the better. He assured me that we had done everything we could, opening our home and our hearts to Alice, even when she was on the brink of self-ruin. He said that we now had to focus on ourselves, our dreams, our goals, and the relationships that reciprocated our care. Though it hurt, I began to see the wisdom in his words. Loving someone doesn't mean enabling them, and being loyal doesn't mean drowning alongside them. I poured myself into my own life, my job, my hobbies, and my marriage, trying to reclaim the energy I had poured into Alice's struggles. My friends noticed I smiled a bit more freely, once I stopped stalking her social media or asking mutual friends for updates. A smoldering ache remained, but it was duller, muted by time and the slow process of healing. Every so often, I'd hear an offhand comment about Alice's chaotic lifestyle, or how she was still trying to juggle her career while reconciling with her ex. It didn't surprise me anymore. She was on a path I could neither endorse nor follow. This isn't the sort of story that ends with a triumphant comeback or a simple happily ever after. Sometimes, life's lessons come wrapped in heartbreak, teaching us how to protect our own boundaries when someone else's world caves in. The court hearing for custody arrived after many delays. According to Ken, it was an emotionally draining day. Evidence was presented of Alice's spiraling behavior, her unpredictable outbursts, and the questionable men she let into her home. There were also text messages that illustrated her drunken vitriol. Alice fought back, claiming Ken was over-exaggerating, painting her as a villain to secure custody. Her lawyers tried to pivot attention to her successful career, arguing that Ken was threatened by her financial independence. In the end, the judge granted Ken temporary primary custody, allowing Alice visitation rights under strict conditions. The final ruling was scheduled for months down the line, pending evaluations of Alice's stability. I heard about this in bits, secondhand from Ken, and then from other mutual friends who attended the hearing to support him. In all those updates, the one constant was heartbreak. Heartbreak for the child, for the marriage that once looked promising, and for the friend I had lost. I couldn't shake the memory of the young woman who once overcame adversity with such courage, who had blossomed into a mother that truly valued her child. If that woman still existed, she was buried under layers of denial and stubborn pride. Some tragedies unfold in dramatic bursts, but others slip through the cracks of everyday life, overshadowed by routine and denial. And those subtle tragedies can be the most devastating of all. My husband and I found ourselves in a delicate dance, trying to remain supportive of Ken without feeding the drama. Though Ken never outright blamed me for Alice's actions, I sometimes sensed his quiet frustration. After all, I had been her confidant. Perhaps he wondered if I could have stopped her from going off the rails. Deep down, I knew that wasn't realistic. Alice was her own person, and no friend, no matter how loyal, can fully redirect the trajectory of another's life when they're determined to sabotage themselves. Ultimately, the best I could do was remain honest with Ken about any updates I learned, while respecting the boundary that I'd cut ties with Alice. It was an odd reality. I was more connected to Ken than to the friend who had introduced me to him in the first place. Yet, it felt right, because Ken's priority had always been to protect that child's well-being, and so was mine. My loyalties had shifted, but only because Alice had made it impossible to stand by her choices. And so, piece by piece, a life built on illusions came crumbling down, leaving scattered fragments of trust and love behind. Sometimes, you can't rebuild what's broken. You can only salvage what remains. Weeks passed, and I did my best to find a new normal. While I couldn't replace Alice's presence in my life, I tried to focus on my own circle friends who reciprocated positivity and growth. I joined a fitness club, reconnected with old colleagues, and even found a local volunteer group that helped underprivileged women find career opportunities. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was helping women who reminded me, in some ways, of who Alice used to be, passionate, driven, yet in need of guidance to overcome obstacles. In those moments, I felt a small sense of redemption, as if channeling the compassion I once had for Alice into people who might still appreciate it. My husband noticed my improved mood and encouraged me to keep going, to keep exploring new opportunities. He told me how proud he was that I was refocusing on my own well-being, that I wasn't letting grief turn me bitter. He even invited Ken to a casual barbecue at our place, though Ken felt uncomfortable at first. Eventually, he decided to come, bringing his daughter along. When I saw her, I fought back tears. She was taller now, a budding teenager, and there was a slight sadness in her eyes. But she smiled politely and told me she was doing okay. I wanted to hug her, to tell her everything would be all right. Instead, I made sure she had plenty of snacks and tried to create a pleasant environment for that afternoon. Life has a way of pressing forward, even when we feel stuck in our grief. And in those forward steps, we might find small pockets of healing, unexpected moments that mend us in ways we never anticipated. Ken spoke briefly about how difficult it had been to explain the situation to his daughter. She knew something was deeply wrong with her mother, but she still held on to hope that Alice would come back, stable and loving, the way she remembered. Ken did his best not to alienate her from Alice, not wanting to cultivate bitterness. Privately, he confided that he worried what would happen if Alice's ex tried to secure any parental rights. I couldn't blame him. The idea of that man stepping in after so many years was terrifying, yet the law can be complicated, and sometimes the man who abandoned you is legally able to re-enter your life if he jumps through certain hoops. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. I went on living, only hearing scattered news about Alice here and there. Some said she looked happier. Others said she was more erratic. One rumor claimed she'd cut down on her drinking, only to replace it with spontaneous weekend getaways and clubbing sprees. Another rumor said her ex proposed to her, and she was considering it. I had no idea which rumors were true, nor did I attempt to verify them. I had promised myself I was done trying to save her from herself. If she wanted to return to a man who once shattered her, there was nothing I could do. Letting go of someone doesn't mean you stop caring about them. Sometimes it means you care so deeply that you must remove yourself from the path of their self-destruction, preserving the last piece of your own heart. As for me, I learned an invaluable lesson about boundaries. Loving Alice fiercely didn't mean I had to accept everything she did. Loyalty didn't mean endorsing or excusing destructive behavior. And while it hurt, more than I can put into words, to step away, it was the only act left that might preserve any shred of the person I used to be. I realized that sacrificing my sanity and stability in an attempt to save her would not only fail, but also destroy me in the process. A different kind of calm settled over my life. I immersed myself in new hobbies, spent quality time with my husband, and even started talking about the possibility of expanding our family. The devastating saga with Alice stood as a reminder of how critical it is to nurture the relationships that keep us grounded while protecting ourselves from those who no longer want genuine help. I admitted to my husband that I still had nightmares sometimes, dreams where Alice apologized or begged for help, but every time I woke, the reality was the same. She'd made her choice, and I had to live with mine. Sometimes, acceptance is more painful than denial, but once you cross that threshold, you discover a fragile kind of peace, knowing you did everything you could, and now you must let destiny unfold without you. Months later, Ken won full custody in the final hearing, as was expected. The judge determined that Alice's lifestyle was too unstable, though she was granted the possibility of revisiting partial custody if she completed a psychological evaluation and showed proof of sobriety for 6 consecutive months. Whether Alice complied or not, I never learned. She had chosen her path, and while a small part of me prayed she would come to her senses, I had no control over it. What I did know was that Ken's daughter finally had a more stable environment, even if her mother's absence left an undeniable void. Meanwhile, I still wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of me felt relief, knowing the child was protected from the chaos. Another part felt sorrow so profound, it defied explanation, like mourning someone who had left this earth, even though they were still very much alive. Sometimes I pictured Alice alone in some hotel room, traveling for work, or holed up in Seattle with a man who might or might not have changed. I wondered if she ever thought of me, or the bond we'd once shared. I wondered if she missed it, or if she was too busy forging a new identity to feel any nostalgia. Yet, life doesn't pause for heartbreak, and grief doesn't care if you're ready for the next day to dawn. It just marches forward, dragging you along until you find a new rhythm, if you ever do. Over time, I found subtle ways to process the trauma. Journaling about our friendship helped me release pent-up anger and regret, turning them into words that felt safer on paper than locked inside my head. Therapy sessions taught me not to blame myself for her choices. They reminded me that everyone is responsible for their own actions, and no amount of loyalty can fix someone determined to remain broken. My husband was a rock through it all, listening patiently to my late-night sobbing when a memory of Alice hit me out of nowhere. He never once said, "I told you so," even though he'd predicted her downfall from the start. In the quiet spaces of my life, I tried to reconcile the difference between who Alice was and who she became. It wasn't a straightforward transformation. It was a slow erosion of values, trust, and self-control. One day, I looked at a photo from our college years. She wore that big, bright smile that could light up any room. I looked at my own expression, radiating naive optimism. It was like gazing into a parallel universe, a time capsule from an era that felt both incredibly close and impossibly distant. I set the photo aside and told myself I had to keep moving forward, because as painful as it is to look back at what was lost, it's even more painful to stay frozen in that moment, reliving the heartbreak over and over again. The only true escape is through acceptance and forward momentum. Eventually, Ken sold the house he once shared with Alice, choosing to start anew with his daughter in a different neighborhood. My husband helped him pack, and I tagged along to help with small tasks. As we boxed up the remnants of Ken and Alice's life, I was struck by how many memories were stored in that house, photos of them together at the beach, holiday decorations they'd purchased as a couple, even a child's drawing that read, "Best Mom and Dad Ever." It reminded me that for a moment in time, they had been genuinely happy. That memory was real, even if it was now overshadowed by bitterness. After we finished, Ken hugged me, a gesture that felt both comforting and heartbreaking. He thanked me for all I'd done, for how I tried to help Alice, and for standing by him in the end. His daughter gave me a small smile, and I ruffled her hair lightly. Tears threatened to spill, but I held them back. I realized that while I'd lost Alice, a piece of our shared history lived on through the people who still cared. Sometimes that has to be enough. In the end, all we can do is hold on to the fragments of goodness that remain, hoping they guide us toward a healthier future. Because dwelling on the broken pieces too long can cut you deeper than any betrayal ever could. Looking back, I see the entire story as a powerful lesson in balance. Careers matter, but not at the expense of neglecting family. Love matters, but not when it morphs into enabling or turning a blind eye to toxic behavior. Friendships matter, but not to the point where you sacrifice your mental well-being for someone who refuses to change. The heartbreak is real, but so is the need for boundaries and self-preservation. Alice's downfall was tragic, but it wasn't my responsibility to shield her from every consequence. It took me a long time to accept that, and even longer to forgive myself for stepping away. I realized that sometimes being a true friend means withdrawing from a situation that's spiraling out of control, especially when your attempts to help are met with hostility and denial. It's not abandonment. It's self-care when there's no other recourse. We often cling to the idea that love conquers all, but the harsh truth is, love can only conquer what it's allowed to touch, and if someone shuts you out, no amount of caring can break through that wall. To anyone else watching a loved one make terrible choices, I wish I had a magic formula. But all I can say is this: keep your heart open, but protect it fiercely. Offer a hand when you can, but recognize when the other person is more inclined to pull you down than accept your help. And never lose yourself in someone else's downfall. Because losing yourself helps no one, least of all the friend you're trying to save. Sometimes, I dream about Alice calling me out of the blue, saying she's finally left her ex and wants to piece her life back together. In those dreams, she apologizes earnestly, acknowledging the damage she caused, the trust she obliterated. But then I wake up, and I'm reminded that some happy endings exist only in our imagination. Still, I hold on to a sliver of hope that maybe she will find her way someday, if not for me, then for her daughter and for her own sense of self-worth. Is hope a foolish thing to cling to when all evidence says otherwise? Maybe. But sometimes hope is all we have. A small light in a world gone dark. A whispered possibility that things could still change. In closing, the entire ordeal reminded me that life can pivot on a single choice. Alice's choice to chase her career at the cost of her marriage. Her choice to drown her pain in alcohol. Her choice to deceive everyone about her trip to see her abusive ex. These were the choices that unraveled her world. Each was a fork in the road, and at every one she turned toward a darker path. By the time she realized how lost she was, she'd already burned many bridges behind her, including ours. I share this story not to vilify my once best friend or to paint myself as a martyr, but to illustrate how fragile life's balances can be. One moment of negligence, one overlooked detail, one refusal to compromise can snowball into irreparable damage. I hope anyone reading or listening can see the cautionary tale here. Success and ambition are wonderful, but not if they consume your family. Love and loyalty are precious, but not if they trap you in a cycle of self-destruction. And once trust is broken, it's far more difficult to rebuild than most realize. Sometimes the biggest lessons come wrapped in heartbreak, forcing us to reevaluate our own boundaries, our own definitions of family and friendship. And if we learn from them, maybe the pain wasn't in vain. So this is where I stand. Having lost a friend I once considered a sister, having watched a marriage disintegrate into bitterness and fighting, and having witnessed a child's heart torn between two versions of home. There is no tidy resolution here. Alice may or may not find redemption. Ken and his daughter will likely move forward, healing and building a life that doesn't revolve around her chaos. As for me, I'm committed to cherishing those relationships that remain healthy and supportive, to nurturing the love in my own marriage, and to remembering that sometimes you can't save someone who refuses to acknowledge they're drowning. In the end, life's twists and turns remind us that stability can vanish in a blink, that heartbreak can come from the unlikeliest places, and that we must sometimes walk away for our own survival. The only silver lining is the renewed appreciation I have for the delicate balance of family, work, and emotional well-being. And maybe that's what we all need to remember. You can always chase your dreams, but not at the cost of losing what you hold most dear, because once lost, it's not guaranteed you'll ever find it again. I hope this story serves as both a caution and a comfort. A caution that no matter how strong a person seems, they can still derail when life's pressures become overwhelming. A comfort that if you've had to walk away from someone you love, you're not alone, and you're not a monster for protecting your own heart. Sometimes letting go is the kindest thing you can do, for them, for you, and for everyone else caught in the crossfire. And in that letting go, maybe we learn to hold on to ourselves a little tighter. Friendships, marriages, and families all require attention and balance. Neglecting any one piece can threaten the entire structure. It's easy to say, work harder, or love more. But the reality is that meaningful relationships need consistent, genuine effort. When ambition overshadows family time, relationships crumble. When denial overshadows truth, support systems collapse. And when betrayal overshadows loyalty, even the closest bonds can break forever. In this saga of heartbreak and misplaced trust, each choice compounded the damage. If you take anything from this story, let it be the reminder that no career success is worth sacrificing your closest bonds, and no destructive pattern is worth clinging to when help is available. If you're the one spiraling, reach out before the walls cave in. If you're the friend watching from the sidelines, remember that you can offer a hand, but don't let yourself be pulled under if they reject it. Because at the end of the day, we only have so much capacity to save someone from themselves, and none of us deserve to drown in another person's storm.